So, we will be talking about contemporary literature. And the first question that needs resolving is what this term contemporary means. Its interpretation is very subjective. For all the people, many Soviet times writers are contemporary, including those who are already deceased, such as famous poets from the 1960s like Evgeny Yevtushenko, Andrei. However, for some young readers, the poetess Vera Poloskova, who became very popular just 10 years ago, is no longer contemporary literature, because she was replaced by the poets that are more relevant from the point of view of these readers. So, the interpretation of this term is very subjective, and one needs some sort of clear criteria, which might help us. From the point of view of literary studies, which is still a kind of science, despite not being so clear-cut, these criteria exist. The fact is that the whole history of literature is a change of so-called literary trends. Whatever the preferences and tastes of individuals are, there are objective laws which force these large cultural paradigms to change. They do not always, by the way, totally depend on politics. But they change, and romanticism is replaced by realism, realism is replaced by symbolism, and subsequently appears avant-garde literature, the so-called historical avant-garde. And in the Soviet Union and in Russia, it was followed by the Socialist Realism. And later, starting roughly from the 1970s and 1980s, there comes a trend that can be considered comparatively contemporary, although many people would not agree with it. It is postmodernism. As such, we will be interested by the changes in literary trends, and especially by the process that has been occurring for the past 20 to 30 years, as the late realist tendencies that dominated in the Soviet Union were replaced by a playful postmodernism. But in recent years, as we will see, the pendulum swung back. That is, realism is once more in demand. The reflection, but in another perspective, of so-called real life's truth is also once again actual. As I have said, we will examine literature exactly like history. That is, we will examine the processes and gradual formation of trends. Therefore, we cannot start immediately from what we believe to be actual and important today. We need to choose some sort of reference point. Such a reference point for us will be the late Soviet Union, where the socialist realism was still dominating, albeit falling into disrepair. What is this social realism? A wide movement in art and literature. Look at the slide, please. What do we see here? A war veteran who is telling young pioneers about his exploits. Lenin, who is carrying a log during a communist cleanup, helping the workers. A worker, who by the looks lives somewhere in the capitalist world, under the red banner goes to the barricades protesting against the exploitation. Soviet soldiers guard the border. A merry feast in the collective farm, although this might be the hungriest years. Socialist realism did not depict life as it is. It depicted life as it should be. This is its main feature. Therefore, this art is sometimes called the second classicism. Classicism follows roughly the same principles. Socialist realism, like classicism, had very clear criteria for what you can write and need to write, and for what you should avoid. Soviet writer had to follow the dogmas of party. The Communist Party had to be nationalistic and absolutely had to depict a new dependable, the new positive hero. Socialist writer had to be somewhat of a romanticist, but this was revolutionary romanticism. He had to be a critic of the difficult past. His work should contain the elements of critical realism, as it was called. He had to be a historical optimist, because Marxism teaches us that in the final analysis progress cannot be stopped. And starting from the developed socialism that emerged according to party dogmas in the late 70s, we must sooner or later come to the bright communist future. Many wrote like this, but I'll give you only a few names of the Socialist Realism writers. These people are probably completely unknown for the younger generation, even in Russia today, but they were once the flagships of the Soviet literature. The Nobel Prize winner Mikhail Sholokhov, especially in his late works like the novel Virgin Soil Upturned, about the collectivization, the collective farms establishment in the beginning of the 30s. Nikolai Ostrovsky, the author of the famous novel How the Steel Was Tempered, about the young communists' upbringings during the Civil War and later in the period of great socialist constructions. Alexander Fadeev, the author of the Young God novel about the guerrillas during the Second World War, and many others. This is our starting point. When does postmodernism begin? The next trend in the world literature. In relation to the West, it is a debatable issue. Some believe that it refers to the works of Jorge Luis Borges, of Vladimir Nabokov, or Samuel Beckett from the 1940s or 1950s. Or it begins in the 60s when the French New Novel or the novels of some American writers like John Barth appeared. As for the Soviet Union, this question is also complicated. We will see that the literature of the late Soviet period was not homogeneous. There were writers who were printed and the writers who were not allowed at all at the printing press. And among those who were printed, there were also very different people. There were strict Stalinists among them, and those who were called liberals or representatives of the socialist realism with a human face. But if we are looking for something new in literature, we should talk about writers who acted as if they had not noticed Soviet literature at all, who were complete aliens to it. Such authors included Venedikt Yerofeev and Sasha Sokolov. These were people who, despite being Soviet in upbringing, education and biography, lived as if in a different reality. They will be for us the boundary from which contemporary literature begins, although their first and best works were written back in the 1970s. One more concept needs to be spoken about here. This concept is current literature. The concept of current literature is clearer and more specific than that of the contemporary literature. There is less subjectivity in it. Current literature is literature of the last 2 or 3 years. This is that which we feel as new. It is widely discussed by critics and by readers. But this huge flow of current literature can be very quickly forgotten. The ancient Roman grammarian Terentius once said, "Habent sua fata libelli." Books have their own destiny. In reality, he was not completely right, because as modern sociological studies show, near all of them have not their own destiny. The majority of books, indeed 95%, are to be forgotten in the first 5 years after publishing. This is pretty easy to track now just by using social networks. Another 4% are forgotten in the following few years, so there is only a small amount, about 1% of those books that have been published recently, continue to be discussed. From this 1%, in the end, we get the classics. When people talk about current literature, they talk about the works of recent years, which in one way or another were able to attract the attention of readers and of the critics. The first thing I have to say about Soviet literature here is that it possessed a huge potential of readers, perhaps more than any other literature at any time. First of all, it had a monopoly on publishing, and the circulation of many of the works were enormous. Look at the slide, which shows the novel newspaper circulation. The novel newspaper was something like a magazine, which printed one big novel per month, and it existed for 60 years. 528 writers, 434 of them were Soviet. The monthly circulation of the magazine in the year 1986 was 2 million copies per month, and over 6 years up to 1987 there were printed 1,300,000,000 copies. It was a very huge circulation. The total circulation for all years is almost equal to the population of contemporary China. Let us return now to the sources of contemporary Russian literature, to the socialist realism, to the question of how did it exist in the late Soviet years. And we will try to develop the idea that in that time there were simultaneously many different literatures within one. But in the last years of the Soviet power, beginning with 1960s, the notion of the socialist realism with a human face appeared. I will remind you some names and images of the writers very well known in that time. Poets of the 60s, famous tribunes, politically engaged public speakers such as Evgeny Yevtushenko. The authors of the so-called chamber prose or urban prose, depicting ethical and moral conflict that concerned individuals rather than the fate of the country, such as Yuri Trifonov. Singing poets. Poets had suddenly returned to an ancient way of performing their own poems with musical accompaniment, like Bulata Kujava or Vladimir Vysotsky did. The idols of the 60s, students of the 60s like Vasily Aksyonov, the authors of the young prose. All of them can be regarded as the prehistory of contemporary Russian literature, although many of them survived into post-Soviet period, continuing to work in this time. Is socialist realism abandoned completely in our time? Probably not. Indeed, recently we feel some signs of the return of nostalgia in Russia, not only for the Soviet Union, but also for its literature. Some publishers are engaged in reprinting Soviet literature, not only first-rate, but also second and third-rate, including the mass literature, although its very existence is problematic enough, as we will discuss later. But of course the circulations with which these works are published now are no longer comparable with the former ones. And all that have nostalgic museum character, while the new literature developed on completely different grounds.